Hello, this is Mrs. Brown from Research Triangle High School. This vocabulary set deals with stylistic elements that you will need in order to analyze some of the AP readings that we'll be doing all year. Now, as you look through these techniques, you're going to find some old friends. Some of these are very familiar, things like metaphor and personification you've been studying since middle school. But some of them are going to be brand new and they're a little difficult, so you want to pay close attention to some of the distinctions between them as well. And remember that effective rhetorical tactics can be the use of specific stylistic elements. So we'll be using these to analyze the choices that authors make when they are creating their arguments. Now we'll begin with alliteration, and that's a sound term. That's a repetition of the same sound at the beginnings of words or in syllables in sequence. So lacy, lilting, lady, losing, love, lamenting. You hear all of the L's repeating there. And this is an appeal to pathos. It creates a sensory impact on the reader and kind of has an emotional resonance to it. So when you use these kinds of sound terms, it can create that kind of impact in your audience. Now, an allusion is a reference to another work of literature, something that you share with your audience member. So if you look at the cartoon that says he's a real Romeo with the ladies, that's dependent on the audience also sharing the idea that we know what the play Romeo and Juliet is about and what Romeo is like in that play. So it's a reference to that other work of literature. It can also be a reference to a person, place, or event from history. And there's a specific category just for biblical allusions as a shared Western culture through the Hebrew Bible. And this is an appeal to pathos because, again, it builds a shared emotional connections. And sometimes it can also be to ethos because it shows that you are like the audience, that you and the audience share these things in common. And now for as a fancy way of saying repetition. It's specifically repetition of a word or a phrase at the beginning of each successive word, phrase, clause, or lines. And some of the most famous lines in history from most famous speeches use this technique. And you look at things like the famous Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream speech, where let freedom ring, let freedom ring, let freedom ring is repeated at the beginning of each successive phrase. You look at the we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight in the fields and the streets, we shall fight in the hills. Again, repeating that phrase over and over again. Or this one from Catcher in the Rye, it rained on his lousy tombstone and it rained on the grass on his stomach. It rained all over the place. Repeating this phrase, it rained, at the beginning of each successive clause. That's known as anaphora. Chiasmus is the repetition of words, but you repeat them in a different order. So it's going to reverse the order of the modifier or change up the structure somehow in two connected or parallel clauses. So you'll hear the same phrases or the same words, but they'll be in different places. So an example, he led bravely and we bravely followed. And this is very closely connected to antimetabole, which is a Greek for turning in the other direction. And that's a very specific type of chiasmus. Now in antimetabole, the words are repeated in exactly reverse order. So you get this mirror image, and you'll see this, the first one will be an ABC and then a CBA. So some famous examples include the first shall be last and the last shall be first. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. So that's a mirror reversal. A chiasmus refers in general to any kind of repetition of words in a different order, and antimetabole means a direct turning of the exact phrase. Antithesis means two opposites. It's the opposition or contrast of ideas or words in a parallel construction. Think of it as an antithesis. So you set up your thesis and then it contradicts itself almost immediately, kind of like the little devil and angel on the shoulder. So examples, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, to err is human, to forgive divine, and those kinds of things. So antithesis are two oppositional statements that seem to contradict one another. Archaic just means old-fashioned, and diction means word choice. So archaic means deliberately choosing a word that evokes this earlier time. And again, this can be an appeal to pathos as it brings back all of these memories and connections with things from old. So example, she chose a black steed for the trail ride, or he's been courting her with sweet text messages all week. And both of those words, steed and courting, are not words that you would tend to hear in modern English. And so using them in that context gives that sense of something that's sort of more old-fashioned and brings an emotional connection to a different time. asyndeton and syndeton refers to using conjunctions between coordinate phrases, clauses, or words. So in asyndeton, you leave out things where you would normally have put in an and, a but, or, and in syndeton, you add in extra ones that you might not have necessarily needed. And in both of these, it kind of gets the reader's attention and creates effects. So for an example, this is the villain among you who deceived you, who cheated you, who meant to betray you completely, rather than saying this is the villain among you who deceived you and cheated you and meant to betray you completely. And syndeton is exactly the opposite. It kind of creates this sort of sped up effect. Where asyndeton creates a sped up effect, syndeton kind of slows it down. I will eat and drink and sleep and play throughout the night and throughout the day. So using those extra words in there to kind of emphasize all the things that are going to get done. Now, cumulative sentence is a sentence that starts with a main idea at the very beginning. So it has this independent clause, and you could stop the sentence right there. But the rest of the series, the rest of the sentence is this series of subordinate phrases that just continues to add on to the first idea. So you get this more complex sentence where you have this first part that sets up a statement, and then the rest of it gives you more information about that first opening independent clause. A hortative sentence is one that is asking you to do something. It's kind of pleading and begging with you. It's exhorting or entreating or trying to inspire or encourage you. The sentence sometimes gives advice or encouragement to a specific course of action. And this is very similar to the next slide, which is an imperative sentence, which is a direct command. So in a hortative, it's saying, hey, we could do this. Wouldn't it be great? Let's all think about doing this together. So let's both sides explore what problems unite us instead of belaboring those problems which divide us. So a hortative sentence is one that's urging you and hoping that you will do what it's asking you to do. An imperative sentence, on the other hand, is a direct command. It's like the finger pointing right at you. You will do this thing. Study your vocabulary. It's a direct order that's being given. And there's this implied second person address, that hidden you in there. So for examples, go forth and do likewise. We must now rise to this new challenge. Work together to solve this problem. So a hortative sentence says, hey, it would be a great idea if we all did this. Wouldn't it be great? You really should. An imperative sentence says, you must. So inversion, which is also sometimes called anastrophe, is kind of similar to what we were talking about a little bit earlier. But in this case, the words are inverted in the order that you wouldn't normally see them in. So it's not a repetition of the actual phrase, but it's just messing around with the way that you say things. So if you think about an average sentence, it usually is kind of a subject, verb, object, would be sort of a standard arrangement of the language in English. But if you're using inversion, you kind of mess it up a little bit. And this helps create a specific meter. It can be used for emphasis. So normally we'd say something like, today the weather is wonderful. But inverted, you would say, how wonderful is the weather today? So you're putting the modifier first. Or a standard sentence, she looked at the dark and stormy sky, subject, verb, object. But then inversion would say, she looked at the sky, dark and stormy. So you save all of your adjectives and things until the very end. So inversion is just kind of playing around with your sentence order. And this is stuff that you're going to notice in other people's writing, but also stuff that you, as a writer, are going to want to start playing with to make your sentences more complex and to show that you have really good control of the language. So juxtaposition means placing two things next to each other. Kind of like we talked about character foils last year in English. Placing two things next to each other for the purpose of either showing how they're alike or showing how they really are completely different. And this could be done with color and black and white pictures used next to each other to show that time has passed now. We went from these old-fashioned black and white sepia tones up to modern pops of color. Or in sentences, things like both the old and the young can benefit from these policy changes. Or as you see in these two billboards here, the juxtaposition of a complaint about childhood obesity next to a fast food ad just brings out the irony in that particular positioning of those two objects. Metaphor you should already be fairly familiar with. It's an indirect comparison where you're showing that one thing is like another, but you're not coming straight out like a simile and saying this is just like this one. It often uses a verb of being, like the example here, your toast, saying, it's not saying you are just like a piece of toast that's been burnt up. It's saying you are the toast. Other times it's a little harder to find. You might see things like today was a real roller coaster, or they walked along the margin of the bay. And a margin is something you'd find on a piece of paper. So if they're walking along the margin of the bay, they're walking along the edge of the water, which means they're walking on the beach. So it's really comparing the beach and the ocean to being like a piece of paper. But it's that indirect comparison. It's not coming straight out and using the words like and as. An oxymoron is two opposites placed right next to each other that kind of sets up this paradox. How can both of these things be true? But again, it sets up that idea of juxtaposition of these two unlike things to kind of bring out and contrast, compare and contrast the characteristics of each one. And this could be things like bright darkness, cold fire, devilish angel. Parallelism just means words, phrases, or clauses that are kept together in similar in structure. So it lends balance and rhythm to a sentence. And it can incorporate anaphora, but doesn't always have to. But you want to make sure, for example, that you're not changing up your verb tenses in the middle of things, that you're not changing up the forms of things that you're using. So for example, a parallel structure. Tomorrow I will, and then there's this list of things they will do. Wake up on time, get to school early, and email my teacher. So these parallel phrases of what's going to happen. He loves singing too loudly and loving too much. These gerunds here of singing and loving with the ing construction. The device is inexpensive, effective, and affordable. Now, if you weren't parallel, you might say something like the device is inexpensive, effective, and you can afford it. And notice how the whole sentence just sort of stumbles and falls down if you don't use that kind of parallel structure. So you want to look for that in writing. It gives a sense of rhythm, it gives a sense of motion and moving forward in the writings. A periodic sentence is the opposite of a cumulative sentence. In a cumulative sentence, you're given the independent clause at the beginning and then additional information. Periodic sentence is exactly the opposite. The main clause is withheld all the way to the end. And this can create a sense of suspense and gives more emphasis to the main idea. And some famous examples, you might recognize this passage from Corinthians, and though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains and have not charity, I am nothing. So this main phrase that I am nothing, which is getting to the main point if you don't have these things, is all set up through the beginning there. And you can read through the other things as well to see how the main idea of the sentence is withheld until the end, and it's called a periodic sentence. Now, personification should be an old friend by now. It's when you're giving human qualities and characteristics to inanimate objects, animals, or even abstract ideas. When we say time flies, we're saying that time is like something that goes by very quickly, but obviously time is this abstract concept. It doesn't have any kind of human characteristics. So personification is giving human attributes to inanimate objects, animals, or abstract ideas. A rhetorical question is a question that you don't expect an answer to. Either something like when you come home late and your parents are sitting there waiting, they're like, do you know what time it is? You're not actually supposed to say, yeah, it's about 1 o'clock in the morning. They're using it as a way to point out that you're really late, but you're not supposed to answer that. Now, sometimes in writing, authors will also use rhetorical questions to kind of the same effect. It creates this involvement with the reader, because whether you want to or not, if the author asks the rhetorical question, you kind of answer it in your own head. So again, you're setting up this kind of involvement and connection with what you're reading. And they can also be used to gain tacit agreement. You get the audience using commercials sometimes and advertisements. You kind of get your audience roped in and get them to agree with a series of things. Don't you want a car that will get your family there safely? Or are we going to sit by and watch our company values be eroded one by one? Those are things that are used in writing that obviously you don't expect a direct answer to, but they're meant to make you think and become involved with the question. Now, synecdoche, besides being really fun to pronounce, is a really interesting concept, and it's related to something else that I'm going to talk about a little bit called metonymy. Synecdoche is when you're using a part of something to represent the whole. So you don't use the whole expression, but you just use a little bit of it to stand for something else, and your reader is going to understand that that one little bit is meant to stand for the whole thing. So you'd say, for example, I'm going to get new wheels as soon as my next paycheck comes in. Well, hopefully you're going to get more than wheels. What you're really doing is using just the wheels on the car to stand for the entire automobile. So you're using this part to stand for the whole. Or the general asks for more boots on the ground. I don't think the general is actually looking for just some empty pair of boots. Boots in this case is referring to soldiers, to armies, to fully trained units ready to go. And metonymy is related to that, and this is a figure of speech where the name of something is replaced with the name of something else with which it's closely associated. So instead of saying many soldiers fought for Queen Elizabeth, you would say many soldiers fought for the crown, or the White House is drafting a new policy, where the White House here is meant to refer to an entire administration, for example. And finally, we come to zeugma, another one that's really fun to say. That's a figure of speech where a single word is used in the sentence in two different meanings, and it creates this little interesting pop or twist in your sentence. So, for example, the farmers in the valley grew potatoes, peanuts, and board. Like, we have this set up with grew, meaning something that you would expect to grow out of the ground, like crops, potatoes and peanuts, but they also grew board. So you're using the same verb grew in two particular different meanings. Or she opened her door and her heart to the orphan. Or he opened his mind and his wallet at the movies. So zeugma is where this individual single word can be used in two different meanings. Now, this is a set of vocabulary that you're probably going to want to bookmark. We're going to be using these throughout the whole year, applying them to text, and then getting you to practice using them as well. There will be a vocabulary quiz on it, but not until we've had a chance to kind of explore them and look for examples and things in classroom as well. And that's the end of this presentation.